All the talk, all the time. This is TalkZone.com. Internet Talk Radio.
And now, more Sports and Torts with David Spada and Elliott Harris.
This is David Spada here with Elliott Harris and our special guest Nadia Larissa. Well, let's get to our next guest, a gentleman who played with the Cleveland Browns and Miami Dolphins, an 8-time Pro Bowler, NFL Hall of Famer, 2-time Super Bowl champ, Paul Warfield. How you doing, Paul?
Very well, thank you so much.
Paul, we've got Elliott Harris, who's a Sun-Times columnist in studio, and also our other guest host today, just filling in, is Nadia Larissa. She plays in the Lingerie Football League.
Okay.
And she's a wide receiver.
Well, from one wide receiver to another.
There you go.
Pleased to meet you, Nadia.
Pleased to meet you as well.
Although it'd be tough for her to match some of the smooth moves that you had back in the day.
Well, thank you for saying so. But I'm sure Nadia is very capable on her own.
I am capable. But if you have any advice for a rookie receiver, let me know. I'm willing to listen.
Okay, that's good.
So, Paul, David Spada here. You played with the Browns, with some great players, with the Dolphins. You had great coaches with both teams. What was the key to the success of the Browns and the Dolphins back when you were playing for them?
Well, certainly players contribute, and top players contribute. And my first year with the Cleveland Browns, which is a long time ago, 1964 season, the legendary Jim Brown was a member of our offensive unit. He being perhaps the greatest runner that pro football has ever seen. Certainly you'd get some argumentation, I guess, from Chicago fans because you had the great Walter Payton there. However, Jim Brown is really legendary and was a great, great player. Additionally, we had fine offensive players and great defense. With the Dolphins, I think you could build the same case when you're talking about Larry Zonka offensively, who's a Hall of Famer with a great offensive line containing at least 2 Hall of Fame participants in Larry Little and also our center Jim Langer and, of course, Bob Greasy, Hall of Famer himself. So played on 2 teams that won championships. And we had great players, but we also had great coaches. Don Shula, legendary great coach in the National Football League. Blanton Collier, in Cleveland, somewhat of an unsung hero because he was a very low-key personality, but a great coach in his own right also.
And he had to follow in the footsteps of the legendary Paul Brown.
Absolutely, which was a large shadow that was cast over the Cleveland organization when Paul Brown departed, but Blanton Collier took a team immediately within 2 years to and then NFL championship.
Is there something to be said for that, not laid back, but for that sort of calm demeanor? In Chicago, people complain that Lovie Smith doesn't exhibit the same behavior that a Mike Ditka did.
Well, of course, Mike Ditka, a great player in his own right, and I played in that era when Ditka was there. And part of the Chicago mood with George Halas as its head coach, Lovie is different, but, Lovie has proven to be very, very successful, very much like Blanton Collier, a guy who didn't want to bring a lot of attention to himself, very, very humble, but all he wanted to do was win football games, found a way to communicate what he wanted from his players. It wasn't bombastic or whatever, but the results are coming in. And I think when you really look at Lovie's work of art in Chicago since he's been there, Bear fans would, I think, in Chicago and should be very pleased.
Yeah, a lot of people were hoping after they were stumbling, the Bears were stumbling in midseason, that maybe the Bears would have a horrible season, then that way they could get rid of Lovie. But you look at his one-loss record and where he's taken the team, it's tough to argue against him.
Well, I would agree with that, and I think that you're more interested in results, and bombast, a whole lot of other things, talk and so forth. But it all comes down to wins and losses. And Lovie's gotten his team since he's been in Chicago into 1 Super Bowl against the Indianapolis Colts. Came very close, did not succeed there. Stumbled for a year or so, but he's right back at the doorstep and could be in that big game for another chance too. And you're so right that a few months ago, mid-season, when the Bears had not hit their stride, I couldn't believe that I was hearing the voices coming out of Chicagoland or that area of the country that, hopefully, things would demise and you think about replacing this guy, because I think he's really been an asset for the Bears organization.
Your coach, Don Shula, you got to give that guy credit. When you played for the Dolphins, they were a running team. You had great running backs, Mercury Morris, Larry Zonka, and then he gets Dan Marino, and the offense switches to passing. Most coaches cannot adjust, but this guy did, and that's what Lovie, I think, has done in Chicago. We went from a running team, now with Mike Martz as the offensive coordinator, to a passing team.
I think that that's a true indicator, certainly, of greatness or certainly outstanding coach. And you're right, Don Shula had it. Initially, Don Shula made his mark in Baltimore years ago when the legendary and late John Unitas was the quarterback. And those were not necessarily running teams in Baltimore those years, because they had a great, great passing attack with Hall of Famer John Unitas, Raymond Berry, and other great receivers, Lenny Moore. So they were at the top of their game as a passing team. Then in Miami, with the great running attack that was there, featuring the likes of Larry Zonka and Mercury Morris, whom you mentioned, and also Jim Kick, John changed to a run or ground-oriented, time-consuming, minutes off the clock coach. And yet, then a few years later, when Marino comes in, he goes back. So the flexibility there, I think you're right in making that assessment that, Lovie Smith is that kind of coach that he can make the adjustments, and I think that you have a treasure there, and I think it should be greatly appreciated. And as Brian Urlacher said the other day, that coming out and speaking very vocally for his coach is an indicator of what the Chicago Bears players feel about Lovie.
As a former wide receiver, did you ever say to yourself, why didn't I have Dan Marino throwing to me? I mean, if Bob Greasy threw 20 passes a game, that was a lot back in the day when you were playing.
Well, let me give you an indicator. I forget what year it is, and it's because there's been a lot of years in between, but I believe it was the final year that we were going for our second consecutive Lombardi Trophy, but we played in the AFC Championship game against the Oakland Raiders, and I think the number of passes that we attempted that day was 7. And then finally, when we played the Vikings in Houston, Texas, in the Super Bowl game of that year, and we beat the Vikings for our second consecutive Super Bowl win, we attempted a grand total of 6 passes. So in 2 highly important ball games, we attempted a total of 13 passes to win the AFC title game and then the Super Bowl contest.
You had the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, step up and call your coach, Don Shula, before Super Bowl VI and tell him, you know what, you got to throw a pass to Paul Warfield here if you guys want to win this game. Did that make you feel special?
Well, it made me feel special in that I've been a Democrat all of my life and a Republican president. But, I'm about civility in this sense, since that word is mentioned a lot these days. But, no, it certainly makes one feel, I would say, special when the President of the United States takes notice to what you do and sends a special note to your coach saying, well, you got to do this.
Now, nowadays, the wide receivers, they just don't stop talking. You were such a quiet, humble guy. Do you look and say, somewhere along the line, something got crazy?
Well, I see a lot of things that are happening, and I'm an old school guy who, comes from another era, obviously, and I just believe that, you respect your opponents, you respect them for their toughness, you respect them for what they've accomplished, and you give them the ultimate respect when you're playing on this field. I want to beat them as bad as the next guy, and my whole focus and concentration is doing that. I just don't think that you do it on the sideline with all these verbiage, all this version about what you're going to do and so forth. After all, you're talking about football, and in this sense, is a team-oriented sport. Now, I may feel personally that I may be capable of doing a whole lot of things, but I've got to have people to help me along those lines to accomplish those things. Now, if you're playing in a single sport, tennis or golf or something or other, and if you feel like you want to engage in a lot of verbiage, well, then you can back that up yourself. But you can't account for all the rest of your teammates. So, but nevertheless, I believe in respect and competitiveness, and that's a part of the sport, or all of sports.
Who are you rooting for in these playoffs?
I don't really, as the old saying goes, maybe I shouldn't use the term "have a dog in the fight," but
Michael Vick might have a dog in the fight. I don't know.
Well, that's I won't go there. But nevertheless, I do think that certainly in your case in Chicago, I'm a historian in this sense, and you've got two great teams coming from the old NFL, from a specific division in the old NFL, and great history, and with the Packers, and even as great or greater history with the Chicago Bears, going back to the old legend of monsters of the Midway and the Packers with all of their great teams. So I'm kind of really specially interested in this game, although on the other side in the AFC, Pittsburgh is...
You got to hate Pittsburgh. They used to basically knock you guys around, didn't they?
Well, how can I really sincerely hate Pittsburgh when my wife is from Pittsburgh?
Oh.
But,
that settles that.
Nevertheless, no. I mean, again, great rivalry, as far as the Cleveland-Pittsburgh thing geographically, and really all those geographical state boundaries, the two entries only about a couple of hours away, which is about the case between Chicago and the Green Bay Packers. So it's got all of the things that you had wanted, and the Bears, as you said, have been playing well. They've come all the way back this year, and the Packers were about eliminated from the playoffs, and they found a way to get in, and they're one of the hottest teams right now. That's the game that I'll really be tuned in, although certainly I'll be interested in watching Pittsburgh play against the New York Jets.
Okay. Speaking of history in Cleveland, are you a Baltimore Ravens fan, a Cleveland Browns fan? How does that work? Who do you root for?
Oh, obviously a Cleveland Browns fan. I grew up in a small town that was just southeast of Cleveland, about an hour's driving time away. And as a youngster growing up, I identified with all the Cleveland sports teams, went to the stadium, and like most youngsters, peered down on that field while I was in the stadium and said, geez, wouldn't it be great if I could play for one of these teams? And, the dream came true as a collegian being drafted by the Cleveland Browns. So I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. I have great respect for what they've accomplished over in Baltimore, and that's a part of the old Cleveland organization, but I'm a Cleveland Browns fan.
What's going on with Jim Brown? I mean, he's had a tumultuous life. Now he's fighting with the Cleveland Browns ownership again. I mean, no one knows why he's upset at him.
Well, I'm not necessarily backing off your question, but, I can't really, answer for Jim Brown, what he thinks, what he does. And so, I'm a little bit on the outside of that. I don't know what the issues are, and, obviously no one speaks for Jim Brown. So, will things be resolved? I don't know. And I'm just, on the outside looking in as far as that's concerned.
I want to thank you very much, Paul, for taking the time to be with us. You're a legendary player, a great guy. I mean, these accomplishments are absolutely incredible. The one year you had under 20 catches, and you were still an all-pro player. And you know what? I wish more players today could be like you, show the class, the respect, the knowledge of the game, and I think the sport would be a lot better.
Well, thank you so very much for having me on your program. It's been a pleasure to talk to all of you, and I'll be watching the Bears and the Packers this weekend.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Paul.
So.
That was Paul Warfield, Hall of Famer, Cleveland Brown, Miami Dolphin. When we come back, we'll have another guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, legendary player for the Green Bay Packers, a gentleman Elliott's very familiar with, the writer, and we'll be back in a few minutes.